I, like so many of you, believe that behind every statistic, behind every headline, behind every slur, there is a human being. With dreams, thank you, with fears and the unwavering hope to work for a better future. And that's why our theme for the evening is Deconstructing an Immigrant's Journey and the forces that shape it. We are honored to share with you one woman's courageous journey and all the invisible forces she tackled along the way. We will hear her story told from a soon-to-be-released documentary by Dr. Oscar Guerra, an Emmy Award-winning director, researcher, and educator who serves as an associate professor at UConn. He is also a producer at PBS Frontline, and he's also a wonderful singer. The documentary, Invisible Wounds, Unveiling Migration Trauma, chronicles the journey of Ruth Fajardo as she migrates from Honduras to the United States. But beyond the journey, the documentary delves into the often unseen challenges of reuniting with family and adapting to new lives. Her story is a testament to the transformative power of hope, of determination, and the support of a compassionate community. Oscar, thank you so much for allowing us to watch your documentary before it gets released in November in PBS. And Ruth, thank you so much for sharing your story so generously with us and for joining our panel. Successful stories like Ruth's and others we support at B1C require a whole community of people working together. And I would like to thank several of them who are here with us today. First, we could not do this work without the support from our public officials. Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas, State's Attorney, Paul Forensek, State Representatives Rachel Khanna and Matt Blumenthal, Member of the Board of Representatives Jonathan Jacobson, and any other public officials I may have not mentioned. Thank you so much for being here today. I also want to express our heartfelt gratitude to our event sponsors and our silent auction donors for making this wonderful event possible, with a special shout out to our top corporate sponsors, Stanford Health and Holman O'Hara. Thank you as well to our events committee, Sonia Alcantarilla, and our co-chairs, Ann Downey, Sarita Hanley, Marianne Kahn, and our wonderful development team for putting together yet another fantastic event. I'm also immensely grateful to our staff, our volunteers, our board, and our board alumni group. It makes me incredibly happy to see so many of you gathered here today, because it is all of us together who make B1C B1C. You are the ones welcoming the immigrants that come through our doors every day, regardless of their backgrounds and their status. You are the ones understanding their needs and providing life-changing support. You serve as advocates to help them navigate the complex and often daunting path to integration. In the first 6 months of the year alone, B1C has been able to provide support to more than 3,000 individuals. This is 18% more than in the first 6 months of last year. And we did so in many different ways, from improving their English language skills to getting them ready for jobs, assessing and addressing their needs, providing immigration legal services, or looking after the academic success of their children. So much done, but yet so much more to do. It is the collective effort of an entire community, volunteers, donors, policymakers, all of you in this room, your families, your friends, your neighbors, that make it possible for us to create an environment where immigrants and ultimately all of us can thrive. It is so fitting that we are celebrating this event during Welcoming Week, a week dedicated across the nation to building connections and affirming the importance of welcoming and inclusive places. Tonight, as we watch this documentary and engage in the panel discussion that will follow, let us be inspired by the resilience and the strength of the individuals we serve, recognizing the invaluable contributions they make to our society and our economy. Let us continue to work together, building one community where everyone, regardless of their background, has the opportunity to succeed. Thank you for being here, for your support, and for believing in the power of the collective. And now, please enjoy the premiere of Invisible Bonds, Unveiling Migration Trauma. Before we get started, I also want to say a few words about how B1C is responding to possible upcoming policy changes. As you know, there will be a new president in January 2025. So B1C actively monitors federal immigration law and policy, and we are currently working together with other organizations across Connecticut on a scenario planning in preparation for potential critical immigration changes that may be implemented by whoever wins the election. Mainly, what we are doing is preparing ourselves to better support our participants in getting ready for any developments that may affect them. Part of our panel discussion tonight is going to be about immigration policy. However, I do want all of you to know that B1C is a nonpartisan 501c3 tax-exempt organization, and we do not support or oppose candidates for public office. So out of necessity, our panelists won't be discussing the election tonight. Okay, so thank you so much, Sarah, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here with this wonderful panel. Just to give you an overview of how it will work, we're going to take some time where I will ask each panelist a specific question, and they'll each have a turn to answer. And then we'll have a section where you can all write down on the cards that are at your seats a question, if you have one. And as soon as you have the question, so if they're answering questions and a question pops up, if you have a question now after watching the film, please don't wait until the end. There's people from B1C that are around that can collect the cards, and then we'll have a section at the end where we'll answer as many of your questions as we can. All right, so to start, I'm going to ask Oscar a question. Oscar, in your experience, how can storytelling be a powerful tool to humanize the immigrant experience and share public perception? Sorry, Shape.
¿Me escuchan? Okay, you can listen, right?
Yeah.
Just making sure. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's just a quick commercial. Today, the film, it's unofficially available on PBS. So if you just Google Invisible Wounds PBS, it's going to be up there for you to share with family and friends if you liked it. And I think that that's related to the importance of storytelling. You know, I think that everyone here is a storyteller. You, me, everyone's a storyteller. Is how do we communicate certain stories to try to build more empathy? I think that empathy is the word that it's what I try to do with most of my work. I think that the power of film, the power of media in general, it's very important because it's a window into a story of someone that you don't know of much. And all of a sudden, you can relate. We have someone like Ruth here. In less than 34 minutes, you saw her basically from birth to now in 34 minutes. So imagine the power that we have as storytellers. We have a lot in our hands. We're able to see her throughout different stages, and I think that it was a very fortunate afternoon when Ruth came out with a little cooler bag and she opened it and she said, "You think this might be helpful?" And she had so many tapes. It's rare for anyone to have a collection of tapes from 30 years ago. It's even more rare for immigrants to bring that here. So the footage, yeah, I think we should. And the reality that we also have to thank her mom, because she was the one who was sending camcorders. Nowadays, we all have smartphones, so it's easy to do that, right? What you watch right now, it's even love letters between Ruth and Homer, sending it back and forth. So that on its own, it's a very special type of storytelling that we don't see nowadays. Now, everyone is trying to be more retro. What we're seeing here, it's original footage of her growing up. So the power of storytelling is this. Is saying we are not that different at the end of the day. And I think that as soon as you watch it film, and that's why I try to keep it short, because everyone, I respect everyone's time. So if you cannot give me 30 minutes, you're not going to give me 2 hours. So I think that in 30 minutes, you're able to experience a reality that might be very different from you. But at the end of the day, if I were to ask each one of you, if you connected with something in here, you would tell me that you connected in one way or another. The mental health aspect, missing a loved one, the part of it going for education, having kids, you connect one way or another. So hopefully that's a goal, and hopefully you were able to connect.
Thank you, Oscar. And I have to agree, this is, I think, the third time I've seen the film, and every single time I notice something new and sort of have a different reflection. And speaking of Ruth, I'm still very honored to know Ruth. It's been more than a decade since I met her. As you luckily got to see the changes across time in both of us. So Ruth, you're extraordinarily strong and determined. And I think that gave you power over your destiny. You know, you have a lot of self-agency. And so through your journey, in what ways did you feel supported or challenged by the systems you were dealing with? You know, it could be educational, legal system, whichever you want to share with us.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I felt more challenged in the immigration part, as you saw in the video. Being an immigrant is really hard to obtain health care. You can find healthcare nowadays is more accessible, but when I came to this country, it was more hard to find. And then when I tried to pursue my higher education, it was challenging too because I only had DACA, so tuition was really expensive, and working 2-3 jobs, finding extra cash, it wasn't enough to pay tuition. But then policy changed, which it gives anyone who lives in Connecticut in-state tuition. So you no longer have to pay out-of-state tuition, even though you were a Connecticut resident. I think it has been challenging, but also changes on policy has given us the opportunity to reach out more help.
Thanks, Ruth. And while the video really showed us a lot about Ruth's particular experience, I think we can also draw generalizations to a lot of things that immigrants may experience in our country. So Renee, as an immigration attorney, you have firsthand experiences seeing clients with few resources who are leaving their countries because of difficult experiences in their home. So how does our immigration legal system shape their experiences as they seek to gain legal status?
Does that work? Yeah, okay. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. Yeah, the immigration system is complex and confusing, and it's Byzantine. So that's the fundamental way that it shapes everybody's life, including mine. Our immigration system is basically the same structure that was created in the 1920s. We have tweaked it thousands of times over the years, but we're basically looking at that structure, which does not meet the needs of current immigrants or the current United States, quite frankly. And so we're constantly trying to fit people into, round people into square holes, that kind of thing. And there are often there are often no easy ways, there's often no way that people can obtain legal status in the United States, which can, empathetically, it's horrible. It's a horrible situation, as we saw demonstrated by Ruth. It's very, very stressful. And I can give you one example, asylum, which you hear a lot about on the news. The fact is, most people aren't eligible for asylum under our law. Our law is very strict, and no matter how much trauma people have suffered, and they've suffered some horrible, horrible, horrible traumas, if they don't fit within that legal construct, that legal definition of asylum, they are not going to be granted asylum in the United States, which is horrible. It's very difficult, and our law doesn't have many other options at this point.
Thank you, and I'm going to take it back to Oscar. Given what was just shared by Renee and by Ruth, how do you approach the responsibility of telling such a personal and sensitive story ethically and respectfully?
I think that's one of the hardest things to do in my type of work, because for me, the reality is that this is another project, right? I produced 5 documentaries on immigration, but this is Ruth's life, right? So when someone is trusting you with something so important, I mean, you have to gain their trust, and I know that it's even funny that you're asking me this question. And all of this started, it's like word of mouth. At that point, I remember that I gave Catalina a call, and Catalina said, you need to get in touch with Sarah. And then I got in touch with you, and you said, you need to get in touch with Ruth. But before you get in touch with Ruth, I need to make sure what are your intentions. So it was Sarah Sarah was working with her. So it was up to me to gain that trust and that respect to say, what I'm trying to do here, I'm going to make sure that I want to honor your life. It's a project that took me more than a year to put together. So being ethical, but at the same time making sure that you cover all the different objectives. It was the first time that I was working with mental health, and I'm not an expert in the area. That's why you need the collaborations. That's why John Hopkins got involved in here. So finding the right protagonist, the right person to honor, and being ethical, but at the same time it needs to be entertaining. It's like you're trying to do many things at once. I think that it's a hard act to balance, but at the end of the day, you really have to have that trust with the person. Ruth never watched the film until the day that it's screened. This is the 3rd time that she's watched it. So it's a lot of responsibility for you as the director to say, hey, I'm present my view of your life. And this is how people are going to know about you. You're not presenting, you're representing. So it's really delicate. That's why I think that it's half a science and more an art of what we do. And finding someone like Ruth, and in a way it's like, you have to trust me and I have to trust you that we're going to be on this together for the next year or so. But I think that we did it after a year, no, Ruth?
Yeah, it was definitely there's a lot of layers to it, but as someone who's coming from the research side of things, and we have our own practices. I mean, I do a lot of qualitative research, but practices in terms of balancing risk versus benefits to our participants. And so when I connected Oscar to Ruth outside of research, I learned a lot about journalism and the ethics of journalism, and I think it was mutual in that sense. And Ruth, speaking of trust, I know you've gotten a lot of support from organizations like Building One Community, Neighbors Link, before it was Building One Community, and also other community organizations. So how has that support impacted your life and your journey, and how do you think your life would be today if that support wasn't there?
First of all, I don't think I wouldn't be here right now if that support wasn't out there. Probably my English wouldn't be like this good yet. I think all the resources that nonprofit organizations provide is awesome, from ESL classes to connecting you with any outside resources. I have been beneficiary of food, clothing, and BC one. That's when Sarah connected me when I applied for DACA, when I was a recipient. So I think all those little details that non-profit organization provide is really helpful, and I hope anyone that donates to those places, they know that money goes to a good um, thing to do. So don't regret donating, and I think that's awesome to be out there for us.
Thanks for sharing, Ruth. And Renee, back to you. You mentioned in your previous answer how complex it is to be on the path to gain legal status, or how difficult it is for immigrants to even have a clear legal pathway as they come to the United States. So, what are the most important things organizations and communities can do to support immigrants as they navigate our legal system?
Basically, have empathy, as Oscar said, everybody, people, and compassion, and to provide support. I'm only a lawyer. Never forget that every day, because people come to me for assistance, and I can help them with their legal issues. And it is important. I think that's very important. I think that everybody coming to the United States should at least meet with a qualified lawyer and find out what their options are, find out what their risks are. The news may not be good. Their options may not be good. But I think that as human beings, we owe it to people who had the courage to come to the United States and leave their home and come here and start over and make their new home. They deserve to know the honest truth of what their situation is, and then they can make their decisions. But I also think that a really important part are social workers. Because people, when you're born in the United States, you're born in any country, you sort of absorb what the systems are, but you don't automatically know what those systems are when you come to the United States. And we can be pretty strange, believe me. It's not easy. We are not an easy country. But so people need help just getting their children into school, finding medical care for their children, knowing that they have to prepare and file their tax returns, getting driver's license, learning English. I mean, the list is endless. But people need that kind of assistance, and lawyers can't do that. And I reach out to social workers all the time to help people do those types of things to manage their lives.
Thank you. I always talk to my students about the same thing, and I think we have to not make assumptions about the knowledge that people bring from their countries. All countries are different, and one small example is many immigrants live in places where there is not a local library in their village, right? And here we just assume if you need something, go to the library, and there's going to be a bulletin board with all these things. And so that's a huge assumption as, a community provider saying, oh, I'm just going to put it in the library and they'll find out, because they might not even know what a library looks like or is. So thank you for mentioning that.
I'll just add to that. I had an Afghan Pakistani family arrive on visas, but they needed to apply for asylum, a rather large family. And they came in, and they had not sent their 5 young children to school, because every country they had lived in, you couldn't go to school if you weren't a citizen. And I had to inform that if they didn't send their children to school, DCF would be showing up. But I had to find a social worker to help them navigate that.
Yeah. All right, Ruth, how have your experiences shaped the way you approach life? And I know we saw a little bit of the answer to this question at the end, but if you can elaborate, what are your future goals, both personally and for your family?
To be honest, I think depression has been the greatest shape in my life. First of all, because I was so into that state of mind, like nothing good can happen to me. Like you seen it, so many bad things. So in order for me to get off the cycle, I have to kind of go out of my comfort zone. And wanting to be out of that, then I have to ask. But it was a little challenging because I didn't know the language, but that wasn't impossible. It wasn't that like where I wanted to stay. So I think that was the big factor because I didn't want to stay there no more. I found the resources that helped me, and my kids always keep telling me, Mom, I want to be like you when I grow up. But in my mind, it's like, I hope you don't. Because you don't know how much it has been there. So all I want to do is for my goals, it's continue, finish my bachelor's, which I already started this semester at UConn. Thank you. And being a homeowner and pushing my kids to pursue their dreams so they don't have to kind of continue the cycle of life. So that'll be it, and thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And you're already on your way there. Michelle's just started her sophomore year in college, which is very exciting. Okay, and Renee, Ruth mentioned that she's a DACA recipient, and DACA is an issue that we could have a whole panel on. But briefly, we know that there's court challenges that questions its legality. So could you summarize the impacts that DACA has had for recipients, what might happen if the courts strike it down, and how individuals and organizations should prepare themselves for this possibility?
In 2 minutes. Okay, so as you can see from Ruth, DACA had tremendous effect on over 800,000 young people who had been brought here as children. I mean, it's unbelievable how many of them have excelled. I mean, it's just amazing. People have been able to go to college, have been able to get graduate degrees. I have a client who is a lawyer, a practicing lawyer, and registered nurses. It's really, truly amazing. And yes, Texas and other states are still challenging the legality. How many years later are we down the road? 12 years later. But I think it's important to remember DACA was always temporary. It was never a permanent fix. And we've always made sure that we look at the entire person every time it comes up for renewal to see if there's another way that the person can obtain a more permanent immigration status in the United States. And now it is 12 years later, and so yes, over the years, the ages that they tend to get married, and some of them marry U.S. citizens, and those U.S. citizens are able to petition for them, and they're able to obtain their resident status, either here in the United States, or they go back to their home country and are interviewed in the embassy. Some are able to obtain what are called H-1B visas, which are temporary work visas based on college education, but those can lead to resident status. So it is scary that DACA could go away, but I really think that the best thing we can do is try to move people off of that onto another more sustainable status here in the United States.
Thank you. Before we move on to Q&A, so if you still haven't submitted a question and have one, please use your cards and write that question down. Oscar, how do you envision documentaries like yours influencing immigration policy and advocacy efforts?
I think that's a question that I've discussed at some point with Catalina, with Anka, now with Elena. I think that this is when we are able to do the mix of policymaking and storytelling, that's when real change happens. Why? And I had this conversation at Johns Hopkins when they invited me to present over there with my fellow researcher, Linda, the one who was featured as well. Documentaries like this don't mean anything unless there's changes in policy. But that is the hardest thing to do. So the documentary is not going to change policy. The documentary might change public opinion. And the only way for you to change public opinion is when you change hearts, not even when you inform that much. So that's why you need to have a good mix between information and emotional information, right? So you need to have both. That's why triggering empathy is so important, because that's when you're like, oh, that could be me. That could be my daughter. So as soon as you do that, you start switching public opinion. And that's the only way in which you can switch policy. Because without policy, the documentary doesn't do anything. If you notice, there are two things that change Ruth's life. Can you think of the two? Who could tell me? 2 points in the documentary. One is DACA. And what is the other one? No, that's part of it. It's Homer. Homer, the husband. So those are the two things that we really need for change. You need that emotional stability at home, and you need the policy to know that you can be sure out there. It was really hard when he got deported, right? So we just have to focus in on a more holistic way. It's not just one thing, but it's a combination of many factors. And I think that if we that's why I think that it's great for me to have this partnership with Building One Community, because that's when we start sharing our talents, right? Me as a storyteller, you as trying to bring that community. And eventually, we have to get together with policymakers, because if that doesn't happen, then what we're doing is just lip service.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Q&A. Just going to grab the questions from Don. Let's do it. Okay. Thank you for submitting them. Here we go. So Ruth, if there was one thing you could change to make the experience of immigrants easier as they start their lives in the U.S., what would that be?
Hard one. I think supporting immigration and the workforce, that would be amazing. Having them something legal to work so they can at least get paid that fair minimum wage and don't work 2-3 jobs to have like a living life, because basically they just live to work, not work for living. So that will be amazing, because that means there'll be less stress, which leads to be healthier, and we'll have more resources to help the economy. So I think that will be something that will be nice.
Definitely a lot of ripple effects if there were better working conditions for immigrants, and then impact on even their relationship with their children, right? And that emotional stability that they feel at home. All right, next question's for you, Renee. So as we've seen in the documentary, policies are big drivers of impact in the lives of immigrants. What policy changes do you believe are most critical to improving the lives of immigrants and their families? And what can be done in Connecticut and at a local level?
Listen, in my opinion, we need comprehensive immigration reform and restructure the whole system, because, as Ruth says, we need workers. That's why people come to the United States. Well, they come for many reasons, but one reason is to work and support their families and improve their lives. And there's absolutely no reason why we can't structure an immigration system where people can come and work and do that. On a realistic level, because we all know there's not a lot of hope on that in the immediate future. I think that I have to apologize. I really can't speak to Connecticut. I'm sorry. I'm not a policy analyst and I'm not an advocate. I do law. So on a federal level, there are policies that the immigration authorities can implement to make things easier, plus including granting temporary work permits so that people can work legally. There's nothing to stop them from doing that. Well, Texas. But other than that, there's nothing else that can stop them. That's one thing. There are also other things that, for example, the government just made a policy in August whereby spouses of U.S. citizens who have been here for more than 10 years, which there are a lot of them, I'm telling you right now, no longer have to travel back to their home countries to be interviewed in order to come back with resident status. They can do it here. So those little things can make a big difference in people's lives. I guess that's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Oscar, what is the difference between the stories we see in mainstream media and your line of work?
Everything. No, and I get it. From a producer's point of view, sometimes producers get a couple of days to produce a piece of work. This took me a year. So you have the luxury of time, which is a luxury when you're doing proper research and you're doing investigation. The reality is that mainstream media, and we see it nowadays, it's a business, and the thing is, it's kind of hard to get stories like this. Why? Because it's harder to sell something like this when you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to watch it. I want to hear give me in 30 seconds what happened and just reinforce what I already know. That's why this is so different. And in here, I know that I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm going to have a presentation in Indiana University, which is going to be a different crowd in here. So I'm looking forward to conversations like that because it's night and day. I don't think that you would see something like this. I think that sometimes networks like PBS, that's why I like partnering up with them, they do little stories. We have the time when they visited the both of you, right? But it was a 10-minute piece on something very, very small. This is a deep exploration, so I think that we do have the luxury of time, but hopefully we can start sparking more conversations. And the real challenge for a new generation of producers, and I'm a professor at UConn, so that's part of my challenge, is how can we reach out that new audience? Because it's not going to be through PBS, and it's not going to be through a 30-minute or longer. Everything is being reduced, so how can we reach out to that younger audience? I don't know the answer yet. I'm trying to figure that out, but I think that the effort should be there. Not on mainstream media, but how do we reach, not mainstream media, but social media and the new generation of young producers? And I have a couple of my students here. Jay over there, and Chris, who was the one who was my director of photography for this thing. So let's have a round for the two of them. Jay is working back there at the camera. So smile for him.
Okay, this is kind of for Oscar and Ruth. So, Ruth, you can go first if you want. But what was the hardest part of doing this film? For Oscar, what was the hardest part of directing the film? And what would you do different next time?
Revealing that I was molested when I was a young age is something like people feel ashamed of, but also makes so much hurt in your inside of you. So I feel like that was the hardest part because I don't remember how we were talking about something and then we just went through that stage and then I was like, oh, shoot, I just told this stranger something that only my mom, me, and an aunt knows. Nobody else knew. So basically, telling him I knew I would be vulnerable to let the world know what happened to me when I was little. But also, at the end of the day, I felt like this needs to go out because I know, like me, there is so many other, not just women, girls, but boys too. Like they feel so ashamed to tell that, but if they come out and they tell people what's going on, they can get treated, and that's gonna be much better for them. So I think that was the hardest part for me to open up.
And I was going to say actually the same, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to share that or not. So I'm glad you started it. It was very hard for me that afternoon as well, because I think that as a researcher and as a journalist, you're taking the notes, but you're also a person, and I'm also a dad of a 6-year-old. So I had a really rough afternoon that day, and I remember that I called Sarah and Linda, and we had to debrief a little bit just to see what was going on. The reality is that you saw 34 minutes, but there's 42 and a half hours of footage that has to be compressed into 34 minutes. So that interview was almost like a 2-hour interview that we had just on, and I think that 45 minutes were dedicated to that part. So And yeah, we were not even expecting. That was not part of my questions, because you have to be very respectful if the person decides to open up or not, and then you have to tackle it. And there were so many things that we had to discuss, not just that part, about some other things that we had. You need to have that constant dialogue with the person, saying, hey, is it okay if we talk about this? If we do, how do we handle it? There were a few things that Ruth told me, I don't want to talk about that. And then, you know what you say? Of course. And then you move on to the next thing. But that part for me was really tough, because I felt a lot of responsibility. I felt honor, but a lot of responsibility that time, because it affects you as well. And filmmaking, it's a very lonely process as well. So I think that while I was going through all that, it was also really hard for me to understand that I was getting related, me as a migrant myself, in different conditions, but feeling that loneliness, realizing what is the American dream, and is it a myth? Is it something that people tell you about, and once you're here you have something very different? And I'm working on something, but then I see myself reflected in Ruth as well. It was a tough winter for me to do this.
Yeah, I have to say, that's another way I think our experiences overlap, you as a journalist and me as a researcher. There's a lot of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma that can happen during these interviews, but something that's always really struck me is how cathartic the experience of sharing for immigrants. It is a lot of times they say, I've never shared my migration story with anyone. No one has ever asked me. And maybe the assumption is they're very private things. A lot of times you're sharing trauma, and maybe that's not something we imagine someone would be willing to share, but there's also something very therapeutic in being able, but that's a lot of responsibility too, right? Because we're not therapists. So that's a lot of the moving parts of this effort. But thank you for sharing that. I think you're right. It's going to change a lot of people's lives and experiences, feeling seen in their experiences. Okay, for Renee. Connecticut is one of 10 states that provides some health insurance for undocumented immigrants. How can these benefits be expanded? I'm not sure.
I don't think that's for me.
Yeah, you said policy's not your thing, so.
No, sorry, I have to wait for this thing to warm up. I can say, though, that we, as lawyers, we also experience those, the secondary trauma. We are storytellers, ultimately, and that takes an enormous amount of time and trust to have people tell you often about their immigration experiences and their life experiences. And so, yes, it can be very traumatic. And it's especially traumatic when you aren't able to really give them a good answer that they're going to be able to obtain legal status. It's very difficult. I do hope that Connecticut does expand healthcare, but I have to say that, again, that's sort of one of my lines. I don't do healthcare. I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Don Strait. I'm with Building One Community. And on the Husky question, which is basically health insurance for low-income folks, Connecticut now does much better than it used to for immigrants, regardless of status. So a certain portion of the population, I believe up to age 14, is eligible whether or not you have documentation to receive health benefits. And the Connecticut legislature has before it proposals to expand it. And the way to help achieve that is to speak to your legislators and tell them that you think that Connecticut should do this. Many states provide health insurance up to age 18 to young adults and beyond. So that's one way to make it happen.
Thanks, Don. Ruth, can you speak to your experience receiving therapy for yourself and care coordination supports? What is something you want or need direct service providers working with recently arrived immigrants to provide?
I feel like for myself, talking about myself, back then, when I was like maybe 17, 18, finding those resources was really hard. So nowadays, Husky and all that, it's been more easier. So I feel like anyone, at least for the mental health, should be provided free clinics for anyone that needs that. And I think the immigration community will be very benefit about it.
And I think also an example, when we work together, that a lot of the services that you successfully received, you were doing because even though you couldn't get them through your own health insurance, because you didn't have health insurance, you knew that you can get the services for your children, and a lot of services are provided in child caregiver dyads, and so she was able to get services for herself and her children through her children. And that is the end of our Q&A. I just want to thank everyone that submitted a question and remind everyone, as Oscar reminded us, that as of today, Invisible Wounds is available on PBS, and so we can share it with all of your friends and networks and sort of spread this wonderful story. But thank you, and I'm going to pass it over to Elena.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ruth, Oscar, Renee, and Sarah. That was really amazing. So I think we all have learned a lot tonight from this powerful conversation as well. Thank you as well, all of you, for being such an engaged audience and for the good questions. A few housekeeping items before we close. Silent auction winners should have received a text already. If you are one of them, congratulations. And please check out with our staff at the registration as you exit. On your way out, we will be collecting your name tags. They're expensive, you know that. Always development. And the parking lot will remain open. Thank you all for joining us tonight and for continuing to support B1C today and always, okay? Let's continue to work together to rewrite a more positive narrative that highlights the many, many contributions that immigrants give to this nation. And let's continue to see as well the humans behind the headlines, as Oscar was saying. It is only then that we will be able to build one truly diverse, one community. Thank you so much, everyone.